It's quite amazing to me. And it's been the best work I think I could have ever done. You know, when you're in high school and college, what do I want to do with my life? Well, I went to college and majored in political science. Very marketable degree. You can make a lot of money as a political science major. And I took a class in political psychology in my senior year. And we studied various political figures, Woodrow Wilson, Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, various presidents, for example. And we studied psychobiographies. Why, for example, did Woodrow Wilson dig his heels in so deeply after World War I that the United States would not then pass the Versailles Treaty and enter the League of Nations, which might have prevented World War II if we'd been involved? Well, without getting into that whole story, basically Woodrow Wilson had a backstory that showed a very strong pattern of my way or the highway based on I would call it an emotionally abusive relationship and spiritual abuse relationship with his father. Wow, this is fascinating. So I went to a seminary and I sucked up all the pastoral counseling classes I could. Decided I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna work in a church and be a pastoral counselor. Pastoral counselors, like political science majors, also make major bucks. It's just huge. Plus, I didn't have, those 3 classes I had in seminary didn't prepare me for the level of trauma, essentially, that I was seeing. Went to Central Washington University, got a full degree in counseling psychology up there, did a PhD later in pastoral psychology. So, that's just a little bit about me. And in the process, trauma has really become central to it's the lens I look through at almost everybody that comes through my door. I'd like to start, though, with one of my favorite stories in the Bible. If you imagine this young rabbi on a hot, dry day, kind of like we're going to have in a bit, thirsty, sitting down at a well, and this woman comes up in the middle of the heat of the day to a well by herself, because most people come to that well early in the morning when it's cool. She's coming in the middle of the day when it's hot. Why is that? Probably her face looks hard. There's something really tight, fixed in her. But this rabbi is thirsty and asks her for a drink. And this wonderful conversation ensues. Covers all kinds of theological and spiritual ground. And it ends with this wonderful statement actually the first part of it ends with this wonderful statement of Jesus. If you knew who you were talking to, you'd ask, and he'd give you living water. Middle of the day, it's hot. Give me this water so I'll never thirst again. And Jesus flips the script on her. Go call your husband. Immediately that wall comes right back up. I don't have a husband. It just, even in the Greek, Jesus says, go call your husband and come back. The woman answered and said to him, I do not have a husband. And that's like 3 words in Greek. I not have no husband. We're not going to go there. And Jesus says, and this is just so poignant to me. You are right in saying, I do not have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true. Now, this is a Samaritan woman. They only believed in the 5 books of Moses, in the law of Moses. Who can divorce? Only men. So this woman has had 5 husbands. And there's only 2 ways that could have played out. death, or divorce. She's been left repeatedly. And so that hard, flinty, sharp-edged exterior is protecting a very traumatized heart. Jesus sees right through it. The lovely end of the story is this woman who's coming to the well because she's an outcast. Most people aren't thinking through, the law of Moses says only men can divorce women, so she's had 5 husbands. No, she's just one of those kind of women. That's why she's coming to the well by herself. Shame. Jesus sees through the shame. She runs back to these people who have basically shamed her and says, "Come and see this man who has told me everything I have ever done." That sharp, flinty, hard core has been softened by somebody who sees through her and loves her anyway. Okay. So when we think about post-traumatic stress disorder, I really want to keep this rabbi and this Samaritan woman firmly in mind. I do. I feel like most of my work is sitting at the well being thirsty and sharing with people that there's no need for shame. Let's talk about what hurts. Let's talk about who has hurt you. Let's get past this shame. So, post-traumatic stress, I'm calling this when coping is useless. And I put coping in quotes because we all cope with trauma. We all cope any way we can. Some of us cope with drugs and alcohol. Some of us cope with devices, as we heard from Dr. Jantz several times. The devices can be highly addictive. Some of us cope with over-medicating ourselves. Some of us cope with church. Some of us cope with work. Some of us cope with shopping. Coping in quotes. We're coping, but we're not. And even that kind of coping is useless, most of us can get through life coping any way we can. But when we're talking about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, by definition, our coping skills have been blown away. And coping becomes useless. Okay, so coping is useless when we go through things that just wipe away our attempts to cope. Survivors of concentration camps, veterans from war, children who have been abused, first responders who see really horrendous things on a daily basis. How do you cope with this? How do you get through life with this? So trauma, physical trauma, if somebody swings a baseball bat and hits me in the ribs, breaks my ribs, my body will swell, as my body tries to then cope with the physical trauma. What about when somebody hits me with a psychological baseball bat? What about when I grow up in a family where I'm called horrible names by the people who are supposed to love me, or I'm hit repeatedly by those who are supposed to love me? Okay, trauma in a psychological sense is this inescapably stressful event. Okay? There's no dodging, there's no ducking, there's no hiding. It's a direct hit on our lives. And it overwhelms our existing coping mechanisms. Maybe we were functioning okay until we married the wrong person. I married the wrong person once. I'm still paying. I'm still trying to overcome an inescapably stressful event or set of events. Trauma. Trauma affects the whole self. Okay? If somebody hits me with a bat, it affects my body. My body will heal. I've asked, when I've taught groups of women who have gone through domestic violence, I've asked many times, many different groups, if you had to choose between physical abuse and mental or emotional abuse, I have never yet finished the question. Hit me, break my bones, bruise me, put me in the hospital, that'll heal, but don't F with my head, because that never goes away. Okay? So it affects our body, it affects our mind, it affects our soul, it affects our spirit. Before the trauma, I believe, say, for example, a person might believe in a loving and just God. After the trauma, how can I still believe in a God of love and justice? Huge questions can come up. So I want to keep this whole person in mind when we talk about trauma. Now, we've mentioned triggers earlier, and just let me pause for a second and say, I'm going to be careful in how I talk about what happens to us. But even though triggers, everybody on social media is talking about, my father's a Democrat, I'm triggered by him, or something like that. It's watering down. Triggering is very, very real. And some of the things I talk about might be truly triggering for you. You might feel your heart start beating. You might feel your palms start sweating. You might feel a headache starting. You might feel like you can't breathe. Take care of yourself. My feelings are not going to be hurt if you take care of yourself and step out, get some fresh air, calm your body down. Please don't sit and suffer. Okay. But these are the various symptoms, physical, mental, and spiritual, that trauma causes in us. Just the clinical side of this, I'm going to break this down. There are 3 sets of symptoms that we look at as clinicians to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder. The first, I hope this animation works. Oh, it does. The first we look at is called avoidance and numbing. Okay? And most of us don't realize we have post-traumatic stress at some level because we don't necessarily connect the fact that I don't feel anything anymore. I just wish I could feel something. How many of you had parents, or how many of you perhaps yourselves, veterans of the Vietnam War, Iraq wars? My dad never talks about that. Why is that? Why won't he? Avoidance. Engaging in activities that we used to enjoy. Avoidance and numbing. The brain is reacting to the trauma in part by shutting off as much as possible feelings and memories that cause us to potentially relive what we went through. So very easy, avoidance and numbing. Now the thing is, think about a rabbit in the forest catching wind of a cougar. Okay, the rabbit, the fight or flight response is going to be activated in the rabbit's brain. The rabbit could take on the cougar. I doubt that's going to go well. Or the rabbit is going to back off. And when the cougar hopefully misses and moves on, okay, the rabbit has basically avoided and experienced a reward of living. Very likely that's going to become the rabbit's go-to, avoidance. So this is not a character defect, it's a survival skill. And it's heavily reinforced because every time I avoid something that reminds me of what I've been through, it rewards avoidance. Okay. Second cluster, intrusive memories. And this is what most of us think about when we think about post-traumatic stress disorder. Flashbacks, disturbing dreams, nightmares. Flashbacks are like nightmares when you're awake. You catch a whiff of something, you catch sight of something, certain smell, certain touch, some kind of stimulus, and suddenly there I am again. It's like this horrendous nightmarish time travel backwards, and I relive what I've been through. Or I go to sleep. Now the brain, your dreaming brain has a natural mechanism to just kind of clean out the clutter of your memory system. Part of what's going on when you're dreaming is, the guys in your brain are coming out with their brooms and dust mops and dustpans and sweeping out the residue of stuff you've recently experienced. Okay, so what happens if somebody drops a boulder in the middle of that cleanup crew? What's your broom and dustpan and mop going to do against a 40-ton boulder of this trauma memory? Okay, it can't do it. So people have recurring nightmares because now the brain is trying to do with its dust broom, mop, and so forth to get that 40-ton trauma memory out of your memory system, and it can't do it. So it keeps trying. And so people lose sleep. We've heard from Dr. Jantz how critical sleep is. Trauma massively interferes with sleep. The third cluster of symptoms we look at, anxiety and other emotional responses. Some people just get a short fuse when they've been traumatized. Their fight or flight response is so easily activated now. It's on a hair trigger. And they can become even very violent, even when they don't intend to. It's a hair trigger reaction, especially if they're having a flashback. Deep feelings of guilt and shame. Now, I want to separate guilt and shame a bit because they often get confused with each other. If I do something that violates my ethics or my morals, I feel guilty. I've done something wrong. I can do something about that. I can rectify the situation. I can repair the relationship as best I can. I can repay somebody if I've damaged something of theirs. I can do something about guilt. Shame is not that I've done something wrong. Shame is that there's something wrong with me. Who I am is the problem, not what I've done. So that woman that comes to the well and starts talking with Jesus with all of her hard exterior, when Jesus says, go call your husband, it pierces right through that rocky exterior to that shame underneath that she's been subjected to by being divorced or died on 5 times and now having given up on love, shacking up. And now society and culture are going to heap shame on her. So she's just carrying that around. And Jesus says, essentially, by saying, go call your husband, he's saying, I want you to be free of this. Whatever you've done, okay, yeah, living with a man is not appropriate. It's not what God wants for you. But that's not a reason to live in shame, especially given what's happened to you in your life. Let's get rid of that. Let's flush that out. Go call your husband and come back. Okay. Jesus wants to free us from the shame that weighs us down. Substance abuse, other kinds of destructive behaviors, startle response, very, very jumpy. Most of us, if somebody taps us on the shoulder, we're not expecting it, we kind of get a little jumpy. We're talking about more like jumping out of your skin when you've barely touched somebody, hyper startle response. Okay. And again, a lot of people don't connect the dots to say, oh, what I'm struggling with is post-traumatic stress. Okay. So that's why I wanted to put all these up here and kind of walk you through my decision tree as a clinician as I'm working with somebody to narrow down, is this the issue? And like I said last night, it's my lens through which I look at every problem. People come in with all kinds of different presenting complaints. I rule out post-traumatic stress disorder first before I get to the other things, because the other things might be one of these symptoms, one of the dots that nobody else is connecting. One time years ago, and I'll never forget this young woman came to me when I worked at a drug and alcohol treatment center. I was a therapist helping the drug and alcohol counselors do trauma work while they were doing addiction treatment. And she came in head down, just the picture of shame. And I'm the craziest person you've ever worked with. Interesting thing to start off a conversation with a therapist, right? I'm the craziest person you'll ever meet. Why is that? She rattled off, I don't know, a dozen different diagnoses, depression, anxiety, borderline personality disorder, eating disorder, alcohol and drug abuse. I mean, she rattled them all off. See, I'm nuts. So this was a Holy Spirit thing. I got out a yellow pad and just scattershot wrote all those diagnoses down. I said, this is probably what you feel like, right? She said, lifted her head enough to go down again. So let me rip that off. Let me try this again. And I put in big letters at the top of the paper, PTSD, and underlined it, and I listed all her diagnoses under that. You've been traumatized. Does all these diagnoses make sense now in light of post-traumatic stress? Her head came up. You mean I'm not crazy? No, you've been traumatized. Let's talk. Okay. So causes of PTSD, and this is a graphic that surprised me actually, because we usually think of trauma in terms of veterans going through war or somebody going through a natural disaster. Tornado levels your town and your house is still standing and all your neighbors' houses were leveled. Why is that? But really that's down here at the bottom, traffic accident. What causes the most post-traumatic stress disorder? Physical assault. Okay. Huge number of my patients have experienced physical assault, often more than once. PTSD is not about veterans in a war. That's actually a very small percentage. In fact, I'm not sure. Weapon assault, I think, is what's covering that. But up here, these high numbers, physical assault, sexual trauma, sexual assault and rape, sudden death of a loved one. I'm not sure what transportation was, unless that was highway accident. I didn't go back and look for that. Illness or injury. A third of people who suffer a serious illness or injury develop post-traumatic stress symptoms. And then severe suffering, I think that's a pretty broad term, but again, 21% of people who go through, say, something long-term that just doesn't relent develop post-traumatic stress symptoms. Okay. So I hope you can see from this that trauma is a daily reality. And most people who have it don't see themselves as having it. They either push it away, don't think about it, or they zero in on the thing that makes the most sense to them to explain why they're so quote-unquote crazy, when they're not crazy at all. This graphic also can be pretty eye-opening. Occurrence of PTSD in suburban police, firefighters, and military veterans. And this statistic has held true at least since Vietnam, maybe back to World War II. About 30% of veterans come back from combat with post-traumatic stress disorder, and most of these went into combat with a history of trauma. In other words, combat didn't cause their PTSD. It exacerbated the trauma they carried into war. Okay, so first responders and soldiers, okay, PTSD, that fits pretty well. Adults who have experienced rape, 36% will develop PTSD. Now, let's flip the script here for a second. Okay, we might think that anybody who suffers something like a sexual assault is going to develop trauma reactions. They might temporarily, but only a little over 1 out of 3 develop all-out post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's think about the resilience on the other side here of all of these bar graphs. How many people go through really awful things and are resilient? We heard a lot about resilience last night and the factors that make up for it, that bring about resilience. So, let's honor those who have been through horrendous things and have not developed PTSD, at least not long term. Women who have gone through domestic violence, almost half are going to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And I would wonder, a lot of women who have gone through domestic violence that I have worked with, this isn't their first violent relationship. Maybe what happens after several violent relationships. And then here's the saddest one of all, half of children who experience abuse. You might have had a doctor's appointment recently where they give you this little questionnaire about, it's got 10 items on it. It's called Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs. It's becoming a first line of assessment in primary care. One of my jobs was in Walla Walla at Farm Workers Clinic doing behavioral health consultation with the primary care doctors. And I was pleased to see they were assessing what kinds of things did you experience, because the research is very clear that the more of the, I should bring back the previous picture, the more that you have experienced before the age of 10 or 12, the more likely it is you're going to have mental and physical problems in adulthood, and maybe even an earlier death than your genetic setup would have suggested. So now doctors, medical doctors, are assessing for this, because so much, diabetes, other chronic illnesses, addictions, anxiety disorders, and so forth often trace back to these early experiences. Just to give you a sense, Dr. Jantz talked about SPECT scans that Dr. Daniel Amen does down in California and other places around the country. These are actually fMRI scans, but they did a study, put the soldiers back from combat in a machine that measures blood flow in the brain. And those who were not diagnosed with PTSD, looking at pictures of combat, they had a little bit of activation. But look what happens when you have PTSD and you see pictures of combat. Pictures. Okay. A lot of people who saw movies like Saving Private Ryan, who had been through war, left the theaters. They couldn't take it. It was too real. Okay. Because this is what's going on in their brain. The brighter the color, the greater the activity. I also want to talk about a newer diagnosis or additional diagnosis, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so went through that hurricane that came through New Orleans and the destruction and the flooding and, had PTSD. What about people who were born to a mother who abuses heroin, and then into a family where there's domestic violence and drug abuse and poverty, lack of access to food and basic resources, in a poor neighborhood where the schools don't perform and don't educate as well as schools in higher income neighborhoods? That child now reaching adulthood may well have developed post-traumatic stress disorder and never have experienced a thing. I call it death by 1,000 cuts. That when you grow up in environments where these various stressors are pretty constant and unrelenting, post-traumatic stress disorder develops. This isn't in the American Diagnostic Manual yet, but it's in the United Nations World Health Organization Diagnostic Manual. The Europeans have really jumped ahead of us on this. That a recognition that in addition to the basic 3 clusters of symptoms, that when you've gone through repeated trauma over a long period of time, you get these additional disturbances. And these disturbances you'll find in PTSD anyway, but they're just more exacerbated. Why did this woman marry 5 times before she got to talk to Jesus at the well? Who knows how she grew up? know. Okay, PTSD and addiction. We've heard a lot about addiction. We're going to hear more. But the best, quote unquote, way, if your fight, flight, freeze response is activated constantly and you're desperate, what are you going to turn to? Something that works quickly. Okay? Alcohol works really well if you have post-traumatic stress disorder. You'll feel better in less than 5 minutes. Heroin works great, works faster than that. The trauma symptoms can be so painful and so overwhelming that people start with a glass of wine or a couple of beers to take the edge off. That gradually grows. One patient I worked with was 24, that he'd admit to, 24 12-ounce beers every day, where his doctor was telling him, because the guy comes in and said, I know I got to cut back, doc. She said, you can't. You'll die. This will kill you. We got to go. We got to hospitalize you and get you down. Okay. So all the traditional causes of addiction are often ways of self-medicating for trauma. Now, I want to mention other issues. And this isn't an exclusive problem in churches, but I think churches accidentally fall into this trap. Or people who attend churches and really cling to churches fall into this trap. It's called spiritual bypassing, using spiritual explanations to avoid complicated emotions and feelings. So spiritual bypassing is, hey, God's got this. Everything happens for a reason. Jesus is my co-pilot. Jesus, what is the song? Jesus, take the wheel. Now, those things are all factually true. But spiritual bypassing is using facts to avoid real feelings. Okay? And I think it's really easy to fall into this trap because the culture of Christianity, sadly, Pope Francis talks about the church as a hospital for the wounded. And I really like that. It was on almost his first day in his papacy. And I like the idea of church as a hospital for the wounded. But that's not what we experience when we go to church. We experience a bunch of happy people. And we get the message that we should be happy too. And we also know people at church who've gone through tough stuff who can just say, hey, I just put my trust in Jesus and Jesus took care of it. I'm happy. Maybe they are. I don't know. I'm not going to judge. But I also know that a lot of people survive by spiritual bypassing. Okay. Also addictive, toxic positivity, which is pretty much very similar to spiritual bypassing. When you talk about all that stuff, it just really makes me uncomfortable. I think you should just try being more optimistic. I think you should take a positive attitude, You should just be more grateful. You should be all true, factually. But toxic positivity helps me to use positivity to avoid real feelings. Okay? Now, back to the whole self, because I've probably depressed everybody. I see heads starting to hang. Shoulders are starting to slump. People say, "Oh, please, when is he going to end?" Okay. Let's go back to the whole self, though. The good news is that trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, is treatable, but we have to treat it holistically: body, mind, and spirit. Biological and medical interventions, several different kinds of medications that seem to really help with symptoms, but they're not answers. They help with symptoms. They don't cure anything. Benzodiazepines like Xanax can take the edge off, but benzodiazepines are like alcohol in pill form, and they're just as addictive as alcohol if you abuse them. So temporarily, can take symptoms off for somebody who's just having repeated panic attacks, but sometimes I've met people who've been on these for decades, and now, I need to cut back, doctor. You can't cut back. It'll kill you if you cut back. Okay? Antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. Prazosin is a blood pressure medication that seems to help early in the trauma process. It kind of helps the brain to not record the trauma memories in its permanent memory banks. So it's a way of preventing the nightmares from starting in the first place. So different biological interventions, somatic interventions. In my field right now, which is being very heavily influenced by Buddhism, mindfulness meditation is talked about a lot, and I'm putting an asterisk by that because as a Christian, I need to be, the science behind mindfulness meditation is very solid. From a secular perspective, it's very helpful, but we need to remember where it's all coming from. And here's why I did my degree in pastoral psychology. I wanted to link what has the church been doing for 20 centuries for traumatized people, depressed people, anxious people. So spiritual classics like the Cloud of Unknowing, or a famous prayer from the Orthodox tradition, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me. Making that a mantra. The Cloud of Unknowing says, take a small word like God or love and just tie that to your breathing slowly. So it's not mindfulness meditation in the sense of a mindless mantra. It's mindfulness meditation in the form of a prayer to Christ. We have plenty of tools to work with as Christians in treating trauma. But a more secular intervention that's very helpful is this square breathing. Breathing into a certain count, hold for a certain count, breathe out for a certain count, pause, and then do it again. When you slow your breathing down, it signals to the alarm system in your brain to shift from your sympathetic nervous system, your accelerator, to your parasympathetic nervous system, your brakes. Meditation has the same effects. Lowers blood pressure, slows breathing down, calms the mind. Very effective bodily interventions. Also, grounding exercises. One thing that happens when trauma activates is it fires up the alarm system in the brain. Now, if I'm in a threat situation, the worst thing I can do is think, right? So my brain has evolved, all mammal brains have actually evolved, to do a couple different things in a threat situation. One of them, for humans, is to shut off your thinking brain. Because thinking about your 4 options and problem solving, what your best choice is, when the car is coming at you and going to T-bone you, is probably a very bad idea. You just have to react. When you're in a threat situation, that's great. Post-traumatic stress disorder leaves you always in a threat situation, always with your frontal brain offline or ready to go offline. So grounding, counting backwards from 100 by sevens. This is using your senses. What are 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, and so forth. Keeps your frontal lobes in the game so that you can, when you're not in a threat situation, decide what to do rather than react impulsively. Like, where's my beer? Okay. Psychological, there are a variety of therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy. PE doesn't stand for what we hated to do in high school. It stands for prolonged exposure. These are ways of treating trauma by basically telling your story until it doesn't activate your alarm system anymore with the support of a therapist. EMDR, another acronym, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. Short story there is that while you're awake, conscious, and in control, you're getting the different parts of your brain to talk to each other to do what your dreaming brain is trying to do. It's like bringing in a jackhammer to break up that 40-ton boulder in your memory system, and so that it can be swept away finally. Addiction treatment, if necessary, group therapy, so you know you're not alone. All of these can be very helpful with post-traumatic stress disorder. And best of all worlds, medication and psychology together tend to have the best outcomes. Medication alone tends to have good outcomes short term. Psychology alone has good outcomes longer term. Put them both together, yet longer, better outcomes. Now, I want to wind up by just really focusing on the reason most of us come to church, spiritual interventions. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who was sent to the concentration camps during the war, Jewish. And he survived, and after the war wrote a famous book called Man's Search for Meaning. And his method of therapy, of psychotherapy, comes down to everything can be taken from a man or a woman, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. In other words, if you can find meaning in this horrible thing that's happened, I've learned something I could never have learned if I had not gone through that. I've grown in ways, or I am growing in ways I never could have imagined if this thing hadn't been a part of my life. If you can find meaning in it, very powerfully therapeutic. But also just more pastoral interventions. When you come to your pastor after trauma, you probably have a lot of doubts and disappointments, including, I'm mentioning studying of relevant texts, praying the Psalms I want to get back to in just a second, the Jesus prayer I mentioned. But this, the just world fallacy, this is probably the most painful human aspect of post-traumatic stress disorder because we believe fundamentally, most of us, that if you do good, you get good. What happens when you do great and you get horrible? It blows apart your sense of justice and even God's justice. So a pastoral intervention can be, hey, let's look at some relevant texts. Let's read Job. Usually you want to read the first 2 chapters of Job and the last 2 chapters of Job. Okay? A wise minister will walk you through the in-between. Because Job, his just world theory has been blown apart. Okay, I know I'm running short of time. Praying the Psalms. For 20 centuries, the church has taught praying the Psalms is a good way to give language to what we go through. Praying anger, praying hurt, praying betrayal, praying joy, praying gratitude. You'll find language when you don't have the words. I had some examples for you, but I'm already going way over time here. So I will hold questions for the break time. I'm putting a group together called Putting Me Back Together, Healing the Wounded Personality. When we go through trauma, especially complex trauma, we're hurt in the core of who we are. How do we put that back together? So I'm going to have 4 sessions in September, October on how do I put me back together. The theme is the Japanese art of kintsugi, a shattered clay pot that's repainted and put back together and the cracks filled in with gold. We don't throw the pot away. We just make it into something new and more beautiful in its own way. So I'm going to just be using that as a theme to go through. So there's my advertising, and thank you for your time and attention.